The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th and 9th, 1945. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States detonated 2 nuclear weapons over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This marked the first and only use of nuclear weapons in warfare in human history. In the 2 to 4 months following the atomic bombings, between 90,000 and 146,000 people died in Hiroshima, and between 39,000 and 80,000 people died in Nagasaki. Approximately half of the victims died on the first day. The rest died gradually from burns, radiation sickness, and injuries, exacerbated by disease and malnutrition. Although Hiroshima had a significant military garrison, most of the victims of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were civilians. Approximately 20,000 of the dead were military personnel. At the time of the atomic bombing, at 8:15 a.m. local time, many residents of Hiroshima were outdoors because an air raid warning had been lifted shortly before the attack. The population of Hiroshima was about 340,000 to 350,000 people. As a result of the explosion and the subsequent firestorm, approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed, about 30% of the city's population. Another approximately 70,000 people were injured. 22-year-old Toyoko Kugata, a victim of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, is receiving aid. In Hiroshima, approximately 90% of doctors and 93% of nurses were either killed or injured immediately, most of whom were in the city center at the time of the bomb's explosion, which was the area most severely affected. Hospitals were either destroyed or severely damaged. At the Red Cross Hospital, only one doctor was on duty, Terufumi Sasaki. By noon on August 6th, the police and volunteers had set up evacuation centers in hospitals, schools, and tram stops, and a morgue was established at the Asano Library. Hiroshima's mayor, Senkichi Avaya, was killed in his residence while having breakfast with his son and granddaughter. As a result, city administration and coordination of relief efforts were taken over by Marshal Shunroku Hata, who was slightly injured. On the day of the bombing, Nagasaki had a population of approximately 263,000 people. The atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. local time, nearly 3 kilometers from the intended target, so the explosion was confined to the Urakami Valley, and much of the city was shielded by hills. As a result, although the bomb dropped on Nagasaki was more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima, there were fewer casualties and less destruction. The estimated number of deaths immediately following the atomic bombing of Nagasaki ranges from 22,000 to 75,000 people. At least 60,000 people were injured. The large discrepancies in estimates of the total number of deaths in Nagasaki by the end of 1945, ranging from $39,000 to $80,000, are attributed to the presence of many undocumented workers and passing military personnel in the city. Like in Hiroshima, medical facilities in Nagasaki were heavily damaged by the bombing. An improvised hospital was set up at Shinkozan Elementary School, which served as the main medical center. Thanks to the continued rail connections with Nagasaki, many of the injured were evacuated to hospitals in nearby cities. Different types of nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was codenamed Little Boy. It was 3 meters long, 71 centimeters in diameter, and weighed 4.4 tons. The bomb contained 64 kilograms of highly enriched uranium-235, of which less than 1 kilogram underwent nuclear fission. The explosion had a yield of 15 kilotons of TNT equivalent. Immediately after the uranium fission, there was a burst of intense neutron and gamma radiation. Its lethal radius was approximately 1.3 kilometers, covering about half of the area of the firestorm. According to estimates, 30% of those who died immediately received lethal doses of this radiation, but perished during the firestorm before radiation damage became evident. More than 6,000 people survived the explosion and fire, but soon died from radiation injuries. Among the survivors of the blast, 30% suffered from radiation injuries, which they recovered from, but were subsequently at a higher risk of developing cancer. The radioactive contamination from the explosion was relatively low, as the bomb detonated 600 meters above the ground. At this altitude, the fission products are carried into the stratosphere, where they disperse and become part of the global environment. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki was called Fat Man. It was 3.3 meters long, 1.5 meters in diameter, and weighed 4.7 tons. The bomb contained a plutonium core weighing 6 kilograms, surrounded by a massive shell of depleted uranium-238. The bomb detonated at an altitude of approximately 500 meters. The explosion had a yield of 21 kilotons of TNT equivalent. The most serious long-term consequence of the Nagasaki bomb was leukemia, with a 46% risk for those exposed to radiation from the explosion. Some of the victims died from burns and radiation sickness. Hiroshima was the primary target, while Nagasaki was not. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was the primary target of the atomic bombing, with Kokura and Nagasaki as secondary targets. The bombing was primarily dependent on the weather. The pilot of the atomic bomber needed to be able to see the target. Prior to the bombing on August 6th, reconnaissance planes flew over Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Kokura. Clear skies were only observed over Hiroshima. During the second atomic bombing, Kokura was the primary target, and Nagasaki was the secondary target. The bombing was initially scheduled for August 11th, but it was moved up by 2 days due to cloudy weather forecasts for that date. Even before takeoff, a fuel pump malfunction was discovered in one of the auxiliary fuel tanks of the atomic bomber, but the bombing was decided to proceed as planned. The reconnaissance planes reported that, despite the cloud cover over Kokura and Nagasaki, bombing was still feasible. Ultimately, the bomb exploded almost midway between the two primary targets in Nagasaki: Mitsubishi's steel and ordnance factories in the south, and the Mitsubishi torpedo works in Urakami to the north. The damage was less severe than in Hiroshima, despite the bomb being more powerful. We did not start this war, and for those who do not like how we ended it, let them remember who started it, was the response of American General Leslie Groves to accusations of ruthless bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Groves, from a military perspective, led the Manhattan Project, which provided the United States with the world's first nuclear weapons. However, neither the general nor the scientists led by Robert Oppenheimer could truly gauge the scale of the destruction caused by their creation, as atomic bomb tests were conducted in an uninhabited desert in New Mexico. When the atomic mushroom cloud rose over Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945, the Japanese command could not comprehend what had destroyed an entire city and 70,000 of its residents. Rumors of an extraordinarily powerful weapon had been circulating towards the end of the war. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, had openly warned that his physicists were already on the brink of developing something similar. However, no one could have anticipated that a single bomb dropped from an unnoticed plane could instantly cause such destruction with massive casualties. 16 hours after the explosion, US President Harry Truman announced the use of the new weapon by his Air Force. The bomb had a yield of more than 20,000 tons of TNT equivalent. Chouch! It is an atomic bomb. It is the use of the fundamental force of the universe. The power that the sun draws its strength from has been unleashed against those who brought war to the Far East. On August 9th, the US Air Force conducted a second atomic bombing, destroying the port of Nagasaki. 74,000 Japanese people were killed. 2 hours later, General Douglas MacArthur, the Commander-in-Chief of American forces in the Far East, issued a press release stating, "The destruction caused by the atomic bomb was an unnecessary tragedy that could have been avoided." 5 days later, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The US General Staff had an alternative plan for subduing the enemy on its own territory. According to this plan, the final defeat of the enemy was scheduled to take place on the main Japanese islands in November 1947. Considering previous battles with Hirohito's subjects and their tenacity, American casualties were estimated to be at least 300,000 killed. The US War Department had already prepared 500,000 Purple Heart medals, which are traditionally awarded to the families of those killed and wounded in the war. These potential casualties became a major argument for the necessity of the atomic bombings. A few days after the explosions, a Gallup poll showed that 85% of Americans approved of the attacks. In a post-war follow-up survey, nearly 1 in 4 US citizens wanted as many bombs as possible to be dropped on Japan before its surrender. For the first few weeks, official Washington concealed the true extent of the disaster in the Japanese cities. By the end of August, the United Press reported that the casualties from the raids had injuries comparable to those from a conventional bombing. The New York Times editorial column noted, US scientists claim that the atomic bomb will not have any long-term effects in the devastated area. But only after the first explosion did 50,000 of the surviving residents of Hiroshima soon die from radiation sickness. In early September, American journalists visited the devastated Japanese cities. It is believed that the first of them was Bernard Hoffman, a staff writer for Life magazine, pictured. When the true consequences of the bombings could no longer be concealed, the head of the Manhattan Project described radiation contamination as a rather pleasant way to die.